Good morning. My name's Pete Ring. I record these podcasts on behalf of Air Force Association New South Wales, Wings magazine, and our YouTube channel, Wings Australia. I just wanted to let you know, if you enjoy these videos, please go to the video description and there's links to Wings magazine. And there's links to Air Force New South Wales, Air Force Association New South Wales. And additionally, you can please subscribe. So this morning, I want to welcome Air Vice Marshal Retired John Quaife and invite him to talk to us about flying Mirages and Classic Hornets. So the first, good morning, John.
Good morning, Peter.
So the first thing to address, I guess, is can you please give us a brief history on your association with Mirages and Classic Hornets?
I can, because in my detailed preparation for this podcast, Peter, I figured that I really should know how long ago it was that I flew this bloody aeroplane.
No, don't say it. Don't say it.
Well, I'm going to, and I'm going to for a good reason. But anyway, suffice to say, let me put my glasses on. So I flew the Mirage between 1983 and December 86. I had 3 years flying Mirages, and it was towards the end of the Mirage's era, but not the end. I had graduated off my pilot's course and flown Canberras for a little minute. Canberras went out of service, so you see, I'm the master of retiring types. Then went and did a jet refresher and came through the fighter training pipeline to fly the Mirage. Flew the Mirage with 75 Squadron was my first posting up in Darwin, and from there was fortunate enough to be selected for what turned out, well, it probably was always planned to be, the last Mirage Fighter Combat Instructors course. So I graduated as a Mirage FCI on that last course. Instructed on the very last Mirage conversion course, which by that stage was being conducted at 77 Squadron. In anticipation of the arrival of the Hornet, all Mirage stuff was duck shoved across the road to 77 Squadron, and 77 Squadron under Roger Wilson became this huge squadron that included Mirage conversion training. Did that and then was posted into the Hornet world. So I then flew Hornets from it must have been 87, and my very last operational Hornet flight was in 2003, 21 years ago. Is the kicker. Look, the reason I wanted to make a point of how long ago that was is I know you want to talk about capabilities of both jets and a little bit of a sort of a feel of comparison for that. And yet you'll recall when you asked me to do this, my initial reaction was tentative. And look, and I think it's just that that carry through from the good old days in my Air Force service, where speaking about such things was always a classified conversation, and I really didn't want to go there. So as a way of sort of situating that, 20 years ago is a bloody long time ago, and also the aircraft that I was flying, the Classic Hornet in those days, was a different jet to the Classic Hornet at the end of its time. So when that was taken out of service, it was quite a different jet with quite different weapons systems and the like. So anyone listening to this who thinks I don't know what I'm talking about, well, I do, but I'm talking about ancient history, right? Not recent history. So there you go. So that's me in a nutshell, and that's where I am. So I think I was kind of fortunate to spend my time flying fighters through the transition from the Mirage to the Hornet.
Okay, no, that's good. I remember the feeling clearly when we graduated from Sabres, F-86s to Mirages. Can you just describe the feeling when was on the brink of changing or actually
Yeah,
changing when the first Hornets arrived? What was the feeling amongst the pilots and on the base
did,
about this?
yeah. Did you live that, Ringo? Did you go through that transition, or was it
I
just?
did live that.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested because for a lot of the fighter pilots in those days, that transition occurred at a time when the airlines were recruiting heavily, and so you can imagine that guys at that point in their career, i.e., finished their basic training, finished their operational training, had a tour or so under their belt, were at that sort of logical point where a lot of guys like, am I going to stay or am I going to leave? And so what we did see, I think, much to everyone's surprise, was a rather large exodus of Mirage pilots who did not stick around to do the conversion onto Hornets, in spite of the fact everyone was really excited about the new aircraft coming in. I kind of watched this and scratched my head. And what's going on? Why aren't they keen to fly the jet? And thinking about it later, I was probably still a little younger, so I was below that decision point. So it really never entered my head. But I can see that the idea of going back to the start and having to progress your way through another platform, or I can go off to the airlines and in those days, earn a gazillion bucks flying for Cathay Pacific. Why wouldn't I? And so a lot of my contemporaries took that choice. But there's no doubt everyone was pretty excited about the prospect of the Hornet. Mind you, everyone had been excited about the prospect of the Hornet for some time. I can remember in the crew room at 2FTS in Pierce when I was on pilot's course, breathlessly excited headlines in the paper or RAF News talking about, hey, it's been down selected to the F-16 or the F-18, so the whole acquisition process that was buying this new fighter had been, pretty long in coming. And so everyone was pretty excited about it when it finally arrived.
So when you got airborne for the first time in the F-18 and the Mirage was just recent,
Yeah.
how did that feel in the sense of piloting it and just the first experience of the F-18?
Yeah, comfortable. For a number of reasons. So comfortable is the right word. So it felt comfortable, as in uh, you didn't think about it. You didn't think about it consciously too much, but everyone who flew the Mirage knew that they were flying a single-engine jet, and to go from that into the twin-engined F-18 gave you a very tangible feeling of comfort, reassurance that you were flying a more capable jet. So it felt more capable. It was, if I wind the question back a little bit, and just back to ground school. So the interminable bloody ground school that you have to go through before you even have that first ride in the jet. But for the Hornet, it was done for the first time. Most of that information was delivered to you sitting in front of a computer screen. So you were, tap, tap, tap through, basically driving your way through a self-paced series of slides on a computer screen to learn about stuff. And what you found was this jet was clearly a pilot's aeroplane. It had been designed by, a lot of thought had gone into making this thing be very user-friendly for pilots. Now, coming at it, having flown the Mirage, that gave me, and my like, gave us insight into what a fighter aircraft needed to be and how it needed to perform and what characteristics it needed to have. And what you found with the Hornet, you'd be fed some information about one of the systems on the jet. And of course, your brain takes it in, but it's also running ahead. And I often found I'd go, yeah, that's good, but gee, wouldn't it be good if it did that? And you'd click next to the next slide. And bloody hell, it did, So everything that you thought you wanted in this jet was kind of there. So by the time you got and sat into it, that's another reason why it found pretty comfortable. It was like, okay, here we go. I'm ready for this. This is going to be the answer to my prayers. And in many cases, it was.
So how was the wow factor?
Um,
Just the wow.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, buddy, two OCU instructors want to play up the wow factor. And the wow factor tricks, there were a couple of them. One was, you know, anyone who's ever seen a Classic Hornet or even probably the Super Hornet do a handling display these days will know what I'm talking about. The high angle of attack, low speed pass. Now, I might add that's typically flown at 25 degrees angle of attack, which is nowhere near the maximum angle of attack that the Hornet can get to. But the reason it's limited to 25, and you know, fun fact, is at that configuration, if the Hornet suffers an engine failure, it can actually fly away on one engine, which is why it doesn't go to maximum performance, right? So, as I say, fun fact. But getting up there at those high angle of attack regimes was where the aircraft would generate some really powerful airflow. And, you know, that's sort of, you can sort of get a feel for that by the layout of the aircraft with the leading edge extensions and the like. And, you know, the fact that fences had to be put on those, the twin canted tails, which are sitting out, trying to get, you know, capture the airflow for controllability at high angle of attack and the like. Well, of course, that's buffeting the aircraft like you wouldn't believe. So the party trick at 2OCU was for the instructor taking over. The instructor would just fly a high angle of attack demonstration for Bloggs sitting in the front seat. And you know, what do you think of that, Bloggs? Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, have a look at the fins. Now, there's one thing that you couldn't do in a Mirage. In the Hornet, you could actually turn around and see the fins behind you because of the layout and the visibility of the cockpit. But once you took a look at those fins, you kind of didn't want to look again because they were getting hammered. And the amount of movement that was going on down the back of the jet, that was absolutely a wow factor.
Wow.
And I can remember, I can give you another one. I'll give you another one. Barry Kelly did this to me, and I don't know whether he did it to everyone, but probably. But it wasn't part of the syllabus. But what Cal's did to me on one of the early GF rides, we were doing what he did was give me a brake turn demonstration. So you'll understand that a brake turn is typically trying to do the best turn that you possibly can because you're trying to get the jet turned around in as short a distance and as quick as time as you can. So therefore, it's done at the airspeed at which you can pull the maximum G for angle of attack and all that sort of stuff. So you don't go too fast, you don't go going too slow. The thing with a brake turn in the Mirage, it was always down. So you'd roll into the brake turn and it was always a sharply descending turn. Now you needed to do that to maintain energy, right? Because as you're ripping through that turn, you're creating all sorts of drag that wants to slow the aircraft down. You don't want to slow down because you want to keep the turn going, right? So a sharply descending turn. Well, Cal's party trick was to wait till the end of the mission when your fuel weight was down a bit, go down to low altitude, 1,000 feet or so, and Cal's could demonstrate that what the Hornet could do was sustain a level or climbing turn, 7.5 G, going around the corner and climbing. Impressive.
Wow.
So, okay, yeah, you just did it. That's a wow.
So that, now I'm getting jealous.
I don't know, it hurts.
So when you talk about the air-to-air, let's talk air-to-air. Maybe we can talk about ground attack on another occasion.
Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about air-to-air for a while. Can you briefly describe the radar and the air-to-air system in a Mirage, even if you don't remember exact figures, just the concept of it? And then I want you to have 2 seconds and then step over and say what the air-to-air system looks like in a Hornet.
In the Hornet? Look, let me start. The big difference between the radar in the Mirage and the radar in the Hornet was the Mirage radar was a monopulse radar. Pulses out, pulse return, get a radar return, work the image. The Hornet, in contrast, was pulse Doppler, and Australian fighter pilots have been hanging out for pulse Doppler radar ever since the F-15 got on the scene wearing such a thing. Reason being that the pulse Doppler radar represented a huge generational shift in radar performance, and it was a generational shift because now you had a radar that could detect velocity as opposed to just raw radar return. And so this was the radar that could look against a ground background and see moving targets. So a significant difference that's got, it's a generational change that had profound impact for the Royal Australian Air Force, because frankly, I think that that's the underlying, or the sort of the fundamental reason, or the fundamental accounting, if you like, for the generation change that started to make the F-111 need to be regarded as at the end of its days. So it was nothing to do with the capability of the pig. Great jet, great capability, fabulous aeroplane, but the advent of pulse Doppler radars meant that that aircraft was no longer invisible or could no longer hide. So a change had occurred. The other thing that I probably mention is the Serrano radar in the Mirage, as I recall, your B scope had a max range of 27 miles, and if it had longer performance, that's kind of irrelevant. The point to the story being what you were working in the cockpit was a display that went to 27 miles. In the Hornet, you had the option of changing the range of your display, but the scope range that you most usually use for doing business was 40 miles, right? So if you compare that, so now the size or the range that we're working within for the Mirage, we're working inside 27 miles, usually 20 or less. For the Hornet, you're working 40 miles. So it's basically doubled your detection range in terms of what's going on.
Right.
That's sort of
a bit easier.
And being, yeah, and being the radar being the heart of the weapon system, then obviously other contributors have become more useful in more recent times, but the radar still remains the heart of the weapon system. This aircraft, it wasn't just a great aircraft; it had a great weapon system built around the APG-65 radar, as it was in those days. Brilliant, really good. And for a Mirage pilot, it was again very comfortable, to go from tap around in the dark trying to find contacts to shebang. Now I've got a 40-mile scope and I can see stuff happening on my B scope. Brilliant.
So I suppose probably in a Mirage you could say you spent most of your time outside about 15 miles looking for the return, and yet possibly can you just tell me that the return at 40 miles on the Hornet, was that pretty strong?
Yeah, well, it's just what I'm saying is for a fighter-sized target, you're probably not going to see it. You might get lucky, see it outside 40 miles, but you should be seeing it inside 40. So therefore, you didn't need to be using the 80-mile scope, for example. You're just wasting your time. But you start to be working the contact at some point inside 40 nautical miles. As I say, early days, and that was the first generation radar in the aircraft. Again, that change produced a fundamental shift, and that shift occurred in the GCI world, the radar controllers world, because the Mirage was heavily dependent on the skills of your ground controlled intercept controller, looking at their big picture radar scope, vectoring you to help you find the bad guys. So the whole point or the whole concept was that the GCI controller would drive you, and it was very much personal, and it was very much fly this heading, that sort of stuff, very specific to the task that you were doing, and could drive you to the point where you really should be getting a radar return about now. And even the GCI controllers in those days were very skilled at taking you to the merge. I can remember the guys at the height of their profession, you'd hit to the merge and they'd tell you which way to brake. They knew where the bad guy had gone. It's like, holy hell, how did they know that? But the advent of a better radar in the Hornet changed the dynamic. And so how did that change? Well, You might recall Judy was the code name for telling the GCI controller, she's okay, mate, I got it, I'll take it from here. You just called Judy, and that meant he'd shut up and you'd just run the intercept. While Hornet pilots would take a Judy quite early because they knew what was going on, had the picture. And so the GCI skill evolved from being one of close control into one of, as they now describe it, battle space management. So no longer were they having to devote their entire energies and time to that individual direction of individual aircraft. What they could do is back their view up a bit and take a larger role in the bigger battle that might be going on. And so that was a fundamental change. And you see that, these days, that type of control plays out in the Wedgetail, for example, and the way that aircraft's used in combat zones. It's fundamentally different to the good old days of ground-based radars. Yeah.
So just on your weapons,
Yep.
just quickly talk about the Mirage weapons and what that meant to combat, and then the Hornet weapons without any specifics. Just talk about.
That's all right. No, that's okay. You can do that. So the Mirage weapon system was based on air-to-air, was based on the Matra 530, and when I started flying it, the Matra 550. And I think it was like an early model 550, and later on there was a Magic 2 or something that was introduced. Appreciating that I'm at the end of the Mirage era here, but prior to that, it had been the AIM-9 Bravo, was the IR-guided missile. So the point of that being, the Matra 530, radar-guided missile, 550, an IR-guided missile, and the gun, the DEFA gun pack. The 530, so the radar-guided missile, was so outdated, I guess, is the best description. So outdated that those of us that flew the Mirage towards the end of its life essentially discounted it. As in, if you're carrying one of those things, you might as well jettison it, because it's all it's going to be is an embuggerance to you in the ensuing fight, because it really had no prospect of doing a whole lot for you against a wise adversary. Now, that sounds a bit dismissive of the Mirage, but what it does is it reflects what the Mirage was. And the Mirage was an excellent interceptor. So this was an aircraft of the era of the Russian Bear, the Soviet threat. I mean, literally the big Bear aircraft that were expected to come over the horizon and throw nuclear weapons your way. And so this was a product of that fear that sort of drove the design of a very fast, high-flying interceptor that could shoot down such threat aircraft. So they were at height. And so the 530 was just the thing that went bang at the end of that weapon system that got an aircraft airborne very quickly. Didn't have much range, didn't need to, because it was essentially a point defense system, or basically European theater system that needed to get airborne. Run a quick intercept with GCI control, get a radar lock on the bad guy, launch the 530 in very non-dynamic intercept sort of parameters, and destroy the Russian Bear and come back home for, I don't know, champagne and cigars or whatever. So things had moved on, so a more dynamic threat, a more unknown, certainly more agile threats, and the more, the era of the Soviet Bear had passed. And, certainly towards the end of the day, we're thinking more about fighter v fighter type combats, where you're trying to establish air superiority. And then what I want to do is I want to work into that tactical sort of support for the guys on the ground sort of scenario is what I think I'm trying to build. So the Matra 530, there wasn't much place for it in that fight, right? So that's really why it was sort of being superfluous. The 550 was a IR-guided weapon, but no front quarter capability. So at best, you might get 90 degrees off, you might have a shot, but anything further forward, no shots and no face. And this was pretty hard for Mirage pilots to put up with, because this is an era where the AIM-9 Lima was on the scene, being carried by any US aircraft that we might be doing dissimilar training with, who could all bloody shoot you in the face with their AIM-9 missiles. Thank you very much. So it was pretty hard work having to work a rear hemisphere constrained weapon system. And then that would lead into the gun. The Mirage was kitted out with a fairly decent gun, although not as well blessed in terms of gun sight as the Hornet was. So that was the Mirage. So the Hornet's coming with the AIM-7 mic and the AIM-9 mic as its radar guided weapon and its IR guided weapon and the gun. Both the radar and the IR guided missiles have front quarter capability. And what they bring is a really good overlap between the missiles. So the AIM-7 weapons envelope overlaps the AIM-9's envelope, which overlaps the gun's envelope. And so you had essentially a weapon solution that would match, most of the situations you might find yourself in, provided you could, do what was needed. In other words, maneuver the aircraft such that you could get a radar lock to support the AIM-7 or an IR lock to support the AIM-9, etc. So yeah, and we're talking double the range, So this was a significant improvement over the very constrained rear quarter only weapons of the Mirage.
My word, yeah. So now just quickly over to lift augmentation.
Right. I'm taking that jump with you on there.
You don't have much to talk about in the Mirage, but you can just briefly describe the lift augmentation in the Mirage. But what advantage was lift augmentation in the Classic Hornet in the sense of air-to-air combat? What was the role of lift augmentation in air-to-air combat?
I don't even know what you're talking about, Ringo. What are you talking about?
Well, no. Things like flat slots.
Right. Well, yes. My response is very revealing, right? Because it didn't matter. And the reason it didn't matter was you might choose to talk about lift augmentation. What I'd choose to talk about is flight controls, Ringo. And the reason being that the flight controls were all were brilliant, actually, and done by computer, right? And so what you had with the Hornet was you only have to look at the layout and to appreciate that its control surfaces were huge. The stabs at the back, fins. Ailerons and the like, rudders, and that could be used in any which way. But the thing about it was there was no, and I can't even give you any examples of that, but basically the computer would move whatever flight controls it felt it needed to give you the input that you were expecting from the direction that you'd given the aircraft by the stick.
Yeah.
Right. So it's can fly by wire. So basically, with the control column, you're just telling and rudders, you're telling the aircraft, I want this.
Yeah.
The computers will go, oh, he wants that, does he? And so what you'd get is potentially at lower altitudes, thicker air, you might get a different deployment of flight control surfaces than what you get at high altitude, for example. Right. And the pilot wouldn't know. So hence, that's why I don't know about lift augmentation device. I don't know. The machine does it, right? And not only would it do that, it would monitor how goes it. So it would through its ability to read body rates, movement, and all that sort of stuff, it would go, oh, that's not quite given what he wants, and so it could correct. And so which that's terrific. I should, before I go on, allow me to say that produced a brilliant set of flight controls. It was a delight to fly. It was carefree across the envelope. It didn't feel, you could imagine that you'd go, the bloody engineers would have factored in a bit of fat for mum and the kids, and so the controls would be sluggish or something. No, they weren't. They
Mm.
were brilliantly responsive, so it felt good to fly and felt very similar in all regimes. So, that difference between flying the thick air or the thin air was
Yeah.
not so obvious to the pilot, that sort of stuff. But the other thing I was going to drift on to, the evidence for how good this was is if you recall some of the incidents that we had in the Classic Hornet, and I mean in terms of there was a trucky car had a mid-air where it lost quite a few control surfaces, and Ross Fox's accident where we lost Foxy, the other aircraft was significantly damaged. So the ability of the Classic Hornet, subsequent Hornets too, I guess, to absorb incredible structural damage and still come back to land was a direct result of this magnificent flight control system and the computer laws that were actually able to compensate for a loss of a surface or whatever it might have been. Yeah.
Good design. So
Yeah.
just back to the Mirage quickly. How did you find the same sort of demands in a Mirage? What did you have to do to get the Mirage to do its thing?
Yeah, Mirage was hard work. Yeah. Hard work. I guess that's, I mean, both jets were hard work. I, and look, as a member of the Mirage pilots fraternity, I would tell you there was more aviation skill required to fly the Mirage, and perhaps there was. Look, there was certainly a requirement for you to be more cognizant, aware of what you were trying to do with the jet, and therefore apply the right techniques and skills so that you didn't embarrass yourself and got the jet to do what it needed to do, and make sure that you're prepared for what might happen. There was certainly that aspect to it. Conversely, the Mirage being having the cockpit of the size it was, the Mirage felt more to me like I was part of the jet, or the jet was part of me, than the Hornet did, perhaps. The Hornet probably got there towards the end.
Yeah.
Mirage very much felt like, and again, the Mirage was, I talk about the computer control flight controls on the Hornet. The Mirage was blessed with bloody good flight controls too, in terms of its certainly roll rates and the like. Just brilliant, brilliant to fly. And the Mirage it almost felt like thought control. I want to be going over there, and you were. Very nice jet, but you kind of needed to be knowing, the whole energy and when I'm talking about thinking about what you're doing, I'm really talking about the energy management conundrum. Not so much flying the aircraft. Yeah.
It's interesting. I've got to keep, I suppose, acknowledging the Mirage was a 50s aircraft, and
that's the thing.
Yeah, and it was a brilliant airplane, I believe, for its age or for its time. But then we got to keep remembering, like now the F-35 is in its time, and if one day we sit here and talk about Hornet and F-35, it might be very interesting to have a look at those two. But
that's right.
It is the Hornet sounds like it was that sort of brilliant aeroplane where the computer input to the controls was so well developed and designed that it just gave you incredible results.
Yeah, and it could be tweaked, over the life of the jet, it could be tweaked. So, yes.
So in G-force, it's just people sometimes want to know this too. The Mirage was built like a bit like a brick outhouse. You could pull 8 or 9 G and get away with it. Whereas for example, the English Lightning, if you pulled 7, you started to pop rivets in the wings and fuel would leak everywhere.
Right.
And I won't say that I saw that happen, because when we bounced some Lightnings up in the Southeast Asia, that's exactly what happened. They go,
really?
pulled 7G and there was fuel going everywhere, and they went back to base.
Back that up as
how did you said 7.5 G, and the other thing, if you were about, I will talk about that later. So how did you personally, when you were in a Mirage, what G coping did you have available to you, and was it the same in the Hornet? The amount of
Yeah,
for your coping with G?
no, pretty much the same.
Yeah,
I know the F-35's taken this to a new place, but no. So the Mirage was G suit and straining maneuvers. The old tensing the body
yeah,
muscles
yeah.
to resist the movement of blood around your body. Um, uh, Hornet was the same.
So
Yeah,
were you normally in air-to-air combat, like normally sort of operating in max performance around the 6.5 to 7G?
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. What the difference you found was the the ability of the Hornet to sustain higher G for much longer periods.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like I would come back from BFM or any sort of training that
yeah,
involved high G maneuvering, and I'd be buggered.
yeah,
Taxiing back in, I'd be literally exhausted from a 1
yeah.
hour mission or whatever, which I'd never felt that in a Mirage. But yeah,
No,
sure, on it. Yeah,
no, you're right. Because if you go back to the thrust to weight ratios and stuff like that, you can
yeah,
see why in a Hornet you'd be able to sustain those high Gs. And as you
yeah,
talk about, what Foxy did was, do an upwards one rather than a downwards one.
yeah, yeah.
So um, just quickly, we'll wind this up in a few minutes. Um, how did you how did you what was the wow factor in actually in a Hornet being able to air refuel?
Oh,
Well, I mean, after a Mirage, you get used to all
yeah.
these uh, managing fuel in a Mirage and managing
Oh,
range and managing every damn thing, and it was critical. Most of the time, it was critical. How did you
yeah.
find it? How did you find the concept of in the
Uh,
of actually being able to suck some fuel on board?
and look, I'm tempted to say all it did was add another element of stress, Ringo, because my mind, when you're talking about worrying about running out of fuel, I can remember doing we're up in out of Quanton, up in
Yeah,
Malaysia. And we were doing, I don't know, one of the IADS exercises or whatever. And part of the deal was, between serials or whatever, we were going to chuff off and get fuel from the tanker. And I'd managed to lead our aircraft. We'd gone way north of Quanton, so we're basically going away from our diversion airfield. And I, Fortunately, I was the low fuel guy in the formation, but I can fess up now and say we got to the tanker at the point where I actually had to fuel, or I wasn't getting home. Because which is so. Yeah, it was like that was rude. That was. You'd think that maybe air-to-air refueling would take that stress away. Well, it only does after you've plugged. Let me tell you, and the fuel is flowing. But yeah,
okay.
air-to-air refueling, it just changes the dynamic so much.
Yeah.
You look at dynamics or the management, I'm guessing, of how you fight the war. You look at how Classic Hornet operations were in the Middle East, and it almost kind of didn't matter where the aircraft were based. You look at like every sortie up into Iraq that uh, I guess the guys flew in the more recent ones, involved a tanking evolution basically at the top of climb, tanking evolution prior to entering Iraq airspace, go in and do the business for a bit, tanking, a number of times through their time on station, a last tank before they head back down the Gulf. And so tanking just became,
That part of the routine.
part of the scene to the point where I know in the for the first Gulf War, or the first one that we were involved with, the kicking out of Saddam Hussein, for the air component commander, his biggest fighting risk might have been protecting his high value assets, of which the tankers were one, but A, W, and C and the like. But right beneath that, airborne fuel was his dilemma. So he needed to manage his airborne fuel, not his fuel on the ground, his
Yeah.
airborne fuel very carefully,
Yeah.
to the point where when he was thinking about, you might recall in that first Gulf War where the Classic Hornets were in an air-to-air role right at the start of that activity, and then relatively quickly switched over into an air-to-surface activity. Well, the Hornets were able to do that because of the brilliance of the Hornet weapon system. But the fact that they were able to do that kept them in the fight. If they'd been a dedicated air-to-air asset at that point, the air component commander would have sent them home.
Yeah.
Because to continue to fly him, it would have been a drain on his airborne fuel. And
Yeah, a whole nother, we can talk about that. If you agree one time, we can have another yarn about air to surface. But one last thing which I found in the Mirage was the letdown systems if you were in quite bad weather. Can we just compare what you had in the Hornet to some degree, just briefly, with what you had? You might cover what you had in the Mirage briefly, and then what you had in the Hornet.
Well, I do recall that when shits were trumps in the Mirage, you'd probably be doing a GCA, ground controlled approach, where you know, again, there were skilled operators and others, but you're dependent on the bloke sitting in the hut in the rain out in the middle of the field there, working the ground control approach radar, basically telling you, you know, your left of centre line, your right of centre line, whatever it is, drifting slightly high, that sort of stuff. And then, you know, the good guys could basically talk you to touchdown.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure when they went, probably before the end of the Mirage era, possibly. But certainly I never flew a GCA in the Hornet. You know, and basically, you know, it's a loss of flexibility when that capability went out of the Air Force. But it was all ILS because the Hornet was very, you know, designed as a carrier-based aircraft, so it was to fit in with the ILS and the automated carrier landing systems that the US Navy has been developing to bring aircraft back on board almost hands-off, right? The more they can automate that, the better, because that's the challenging part of the Navy evolution. So yeah, we were blessed with ILS approaches, but otherwise it was you know, TACANs and VORs, so quite similar to the Mirage, but you know, big difference being I can't remember the speeds we used to roar around the pattern in the Mirage, but you know, a Mirage TACAN was something else in the slippery fast jet. The Hornet, quite comfortable at slow speeds, thank you very much. So you could just slow things down a bit, you know, and catch your breath and get yourself under control.
Got it. Well, that was really, I enjoyed your description of everything. I thought that was quite good. So thank you for your input. I hope people will enjoy it. And I also would like to remind people, if you'd like to subscribe to our channel, go to the description that accompanies this video, and also have a look at whether you'd like to subscribe to our Wings magazine or to subscribe to Air Force Association New South Wales. So, John, that was great. Thank you very, very much, and I'll catch you later.
Okay, Peter, you're welcome.